In Trump's war on woke, whatever that means, part of the implicit appeal was to white guys who resented having to try not to offend. But in the ultimate perversity, it turns out that Trump, and by extension MAGA world, are the most sensitive pearl clutchers around. And what they're offended by should offend us all. In their efforts to erase any vestige of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Department of Defense is taking an eraser to American history, specifically to people who fought for our nation that don't look like me. Now, this idiocy first came to national attention when Pete Hegseth and friends decided the Enola Gay, that's the famous B-29 bomber plane responsible for dropping the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, was to be scrubbed from the DoD database because it had gay in its name. Now, after that embarrassment and subsequent reversal, a rational person would have assumed that this moronic DEI crusade would have been scuttled. But then again, remember who we're dealing with here. Jackie Robinson. Yeah, that Jackie Robinson, the man who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, enduring unspeakable abuse and racism in the process. He's an American hero, period. As evidenced by his number being retired across the entire sport, Hall of Fame induction, and so much more immortalized in the film 42, his story, I thought, was universally accepted as aspirational. Now, beyond his exploits on the field and his place as a giant in the civil rights movement, he was also a veteran who served our nation in World War II, and at one point refused to go to the back of the Army bus because of the color of his skin. Apparently, any references to the racial realities that were part of the Jim Crow South and America in the 40s and 50s, well, that was a bridge too far for our new leadership, and his story suddenly disappeared before a public outcry forced its then reinstatement. It turns out these were not one-offs. The story of Major General Charles Rogers, who was awarded our nation's highest citation for bravery on the battlefield, the Medal of Honor, was taken off the DoD webpage because it referenced his skin color. Articles about a Pima Indian who was one of 6 Marines photographed hoisting a U.S. flag on Iwo Jima disappeared, as did multiple stories about the invaluable Navajo code talkers who saved countless lives of Marines in the Pacific by sending messages in a language the Japanese cryptologists were unable to crack. Another legendary group whose historic contributions suddenly vanished were that of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese-American unit whose families were put in U.S. internment camps in a shameful chapter of U.S. history. They still insisted on serving their country in uniform. That unit, famously remembered as the Nisi Battalion, would go on to be the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in our U.S. military history. Because the Army's website noted that the battalion fought on 2 fronts, quote, the Germans in Europe and the prejudice in America, unquote, because of that, the page was taken down. It turns out any reference to American Indians in the U.S. Army, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, or women in the Army were all taken down. That after a hue and cry they were eventually restored, it misses the bigger point. Trump and his minions didn't launch this idiotic offensive because they were concerned that DEI would divide our military as they claimed. They wanted to scour the uncomfortable parts of our history. But this is more than misguided. It's against our national interests. If we try and pretend that racism and sexism aren't realities in our present-day military, we risk making a situation worse, not better. Pretending the uncomfortable parts of our past and our present don't exist, it ensures that we're going to drive away talent from our ranks and weaken our military readiness. High-ranking leadership in our military today worry that the wrong people are getting the wrong message, that a return to the good old days where you could demean soldiers of color and women will impact morale for a huge part of our armed forces. Recruiting, already a real worry, will take a real hit. If the military, one of the few places where advancement, while colorblind, no, it is still possible regardless of what you look like. if that no longer presents that same promise, our national security will be weakened. Finally, the growing fear of white nationalists in our military's ranks will only be emboldened, feeling that they have allies in the Secretary of Defense and in the White House. And speaking of that man sitting in the Oval Office, I'm going to close by reminding you that as we have to fight to remember the men and women who gave so much to defend a nation that often turned its back on them, our president, who dodged the draft with a phantom bone spur diagnosis and joked that his personal Vietnam was avoiding STDs in the 70s, our president, who mocked POWs, refused to be photographed with disabled vets, and called fallen soldiers losers and suckers, that man is deciding if heroism warrants acknowledgement. My friends, we live in surreal times.